Hello, I am Georgina Rose. I'm a perennialist, polytheist, and professional tarot reader and astrologer. And welcome back to the Pagan Perspectives by Georgina Rose podcast. On this podcast, we take various issues we deal with in our lives and provide a metaphysical, esoteric, occult, and pagan lens on it, helping us understand the world we live in through theology. And I would like to say my voice does sound weird. I lost my voice about 5 days ago. I literally could barely talk. It was really rough. Wasn't sick or anything. I just yapped too much. Mercury retrograde came early for me and decided to attack me. So if I sound a little bit weird, a little bit off, that's what's going on. It doesn't hurt. There's no issues anymore. Like I can talk normally. But if I sound a little bit like I smoked 15 packs of cigarettes before recording, I did not do that. I would not do that. That's just the situation. I'm gaining my voice back after having lost it. And this episode is actually really special because if you're listening on a podcasting platform, you might not know that this podcast also gets posted to the Dot Darling YouTube channel where I do a lot of videos. And on that channel, I recently hit a big milestone, 60,000 subscribers. So I wanted to celebrate that, do basically a listener request podcast and video. So I took a bunch of people's suggestions, then I made a poll. And the winner of the poll became the podcast topic and the video. And this podcast is viewer request. It's actually something that I had wanted to talk about for a long time. So I was really, really happy when this one was requested and then voted on. And that is really a long running debate in esotericism. And I phrased this question. The episode might be named a little bit differently. But basically the question is occultism all psychological or is it all external or perhaps somewhere in the middle? This is a really long running debate in the occult community that really, it wasn't as much of a debate further back, but certainly as long as it's been a modern occult community, this has been a debate. And people are pretty passionate on both sides. And I'm going to present both sides. On this podcast, I like to sort of say what I believe, but I also, I don't want everyone to agree with me. That's not my goal. That doesn't really affect me, right? I don't really care if everyone agrees with me or not. So I want to present all the sides from their position, right? I want to give them the most, straightforward explanation, and I want to show, that it's all psychological perspective, and that kind of does take on various forms. There's not like a singular understanding of that. There's some that are much more material than others, even within the psychological camp. That middle ground position where it's kind of both. And then that position that it's fully external. And I do want to put my bias out there, kind of what I believe. Personally, I am theistic. I do believe it is external, but at the same time, I do think our psychology has a big impact on our experiences, right? I think, yeah, it's external, but to pretend that our psychology has no play in it, I don't think that's correct. I'm definitely, I would say I lean external, but I'm a little bit on the middle ground position because obviously, we experience the world through our minds. And so we're filtering it through our minds, right? The experiences are not mental in my perspective, but since we're filtering it through our minds, the psychology cannot be understated. But of course, I do want to present all of the positions, where they come from, their history, and their beliefs. And I want to sort of talk about the psychological perspective first. So there's a couple ways this is put. There was a term that went around back in the witch talk days of 2020, where people would say witchcraft is spicy psychology, and is a little cheeky. I don't love that phrasing, but that is actually a real position a lot of people hold. There's a more serious term for it called the psychological paradigm, and paradigm kind of means perspective, tradition, way of thinking. And I would say this paradigm, it's kind of a newer idea. In antiquity, this is certainly not how it was viewed. But obviously, we do not live in antiquity. All, mystical traditions are to some extent, varying extents, of course, a bit reconstructed. Now, some are, of course, continuous lineages their entire time, but even for traditions that are continuous lineages, unbroken connections going way, way back, when you're living in a different time in a different world, you're impacted by the philosophies and the realities around you, right? You're going to be impacted by the time you live in, no matter really how you slice it, no matter how, interested in reconstructionism you are. You can't, sort of erase all the things that come with living in the modern world. And so I would say this with time is becoming an increasingly popular position. Like basically, the further we go in time, the more people are psychological paradigm people. And psychological paradigm people are, they take their practice seriously, right? Like they do the ritual, they do the work. Now, there are some people who kind of use it as a way to be a little bit lazy and whatnot, but that's certainly not everyone. There's many occultists who do actually feel this way. And I kind of want to talk about the thing that made it big, because there have been, a number of people arguing this for quite a while. Really, I mean, when paganism started coming back, I think there's a specific period of time that we can really mark as sort of the beginning of it coming back. And I would say occultism becoming popular also aligns with this, right? Because even if you are, an Abrahamic practitioner, right, like you do Kabbalah, you do Hermeticism, and you do that in a very Christian stance, really you're still kind of probably doing it because there was really an occult revolution. And I kind of date this the late 1800s to the 1940s or so. I would say it kind of fell off then with the Second World War and the period after that. But really, from that, Victorian to right around the war period was really when occultism and paganism and mysticism really kicked into gear in the Western world. Of course, if you're outside the West, this wouldn't apply. But if you're living in the West like me, I mean, this certainly is when it sort of became prominent. Because what happened was, I mean, prior to this, there was, of course, the ancient world, right, where there were a lot of orders and mystical groups and cults, and I mean cult in the historic sense, not in the like modern sense of like a high control religion. I would say capital C cult, not lower C cult. That's how I would distinguish that. That certainly had mystery components to them, but even then, I mean, a lot of these things, a lot of these groups that were very mystical were more selective. They were more initiatory. And then after that time, as sort of things move forward and we enter into the Abrahamic age, and that period of time after the conversion, it certainly went a little bit underground. There were organizations, the Knights Templar, and stuff that were certainly doing esoteric practice in the West, but they were very much selective groups. And there were, of course, astrologers and high up people in society, like John Dee is, of course, one of the greatest examples. He was this Christian guy who talked to a lot of angels and did a lot of astrology for the crown of Britain, and according to some sources is largely responsible for the British Empire becoming a power, because he really told the empire when to do things and when not to based on the stars. That was certainly a thing, but it was certainly kind of locked in to specific parts of society, right? Like it was not as accessible. Now there were, of course, folk traditions that were running at this time too, and those were, of course, more for the masses, right? We're talking, herbalism, folk traditions, stuff that people would often call superstition, but were, of course, genuine occultic beliefs that were much more accessible, but once again, a little bit underground. Some were considered heretical. It wasn't as accessible, and really people started getting back into esoteric ideas right around this time that I call the occult revival. That's the late 1800s to the 1940s. The magical revival, as some people call it. And in this period, really, it was after the Enlightenment. So there was this big philosophical movement called the Enlightenment. And I really suggest reading my article for Alata magazine, called The Rise of the Occult, where I get into kind of how this happened and why this got big and sort of the factors leading into it. But basically, there was this big wave enlightenment. It was secularization, it was different ideals like democracy really coming into the forefront. And I would say, there was a rise of sort of the beginning of atheism and secularism coming in, right? Like it was very much the rational mind conquering the world, right? The rise of rationality, the war against superstition and mysticism. And, time doesn't move exactly linearly, right? Like this end of history idea that everything's kind of a single march in one direction is not really true. And so I see, the magical revival is the pendulum swinging back a bit. It was people developing a renewed interest in the spiritual, a renewed interest in the mystical. And this was actually very popular. This was no longer as sort of elite of a process as it was. I mean, it certainly wasn't accessible as it is now, but it was more available. There was a big movement called spiritualism that was incredibly popular. Think of it as the pop mysticism of the time, where people would gather and have seance parties and commune with the dead. There was theosophy, and that would sort of lay the groundwork for the New Age. That really kicked off. And there were organizations like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn that also, did a lot of foundational work. That organization would be the predecessor to groups like Thelema, Wicca, and witchcraft, and honestly, paganism coming back. There were also other organizations interested in reconstructing and reviving paganism. And this still did all happen after the Enlightenment. So while it was sort of a move back to the spiritual, it still maintained a lot of those kind of Enlightenment principles to some extent, right? It was kind of like a fusion ideology. It was kind of like a revival of the mystical alongside those things, but at the same time reacting to it and being a bit of a pushback at the same time, depending on the organization. There was a popular thing at the time where people were trying to use the scientific method, which had, of course, become a lot more popular in this time, to kind of prove spirituality is true. And that's kind of where I think the psychological paradigm has its early roots, right? This kind of bridge between the scientific rational view of the world and a mystical spiritual one. It's kind of a combined method of this. And there's a specific ideology that comes out of Thelema called scientific illuminism that I sort of see as a beginning steps for this. Scientific illuminism is summarized by the phrase the method of science with the aim of religion. Technically, it's written the method of science, the aim of religion, but if you add that with, it sounds a little bit easier. Basically, what happens is you have a magical record, you have a notebook, and you experiment with all these mystical things, and you see what happens, and you record it, right? Like you're trying to use the scientific method to do mysticism, and this specific way of operating has kind of fallen off a little bit, but that core kind of held in, where there were people being like, okay, well, maybe these things don't contradict, maybe in fact they prove it, right? Maybe, and you hear this said sometimes, right? Maybe magic is just science we don't understand. And this kind of bridge ideologies where the psychological paradigm jumps off. And at the same time, happening when all of this is happening, you kind of have the rise of modern psychology and psychiatry happening. So, back in the ancient world, psychology didn't really exist, right? Psychology is a baby science. It's much younger than esoteric ideas. But psychology now, it's taken as a very serious science now. But in its early onset, it was quite new. There were thinkers like Freud and Jung. They're all kind of coming up in this period of time. Psychology is really developing its way of operating. Psychological treatments were being developed. Psychotherapy and psychoanalysis were popping off, right? It's all kind of happening around the same time. And this interest in psychology and psychiatry, while this renewed interest in the esoteric were happening, really sort of build this beginning aspect of the psychological paradigm. And there's a specific way of thinking that really, and it starts to push it together. And that is the idea of archetypes, the unconscious, and the mind. So, as psychology developed, we started to understand the power of the mind and how much the mind actually shapes our direct experiences, right? How much of our lives are happening on a psychological level and how much our mental state can impact the world around us. And so, you know, people started seeing, psychology as sort of this way of operating and mysticism. People started noticing that there are some overlapping ideas. And I would really say there was a specific person who kind of played a huge role in this, and that is Carl Jung. So Carl Jung is one of the fathers of psychology, specifically the father of Jungian psychology. And Carl Jung was very interested in the unconscious, the subconscious, and the shadow. And you actually still hear some of his language used really a lot in occult spaces, specifically that term shadow work, which I'm sure you've all heard, really comes from Jungian psychology. He was really interested in analyzing dreams, understanding the unconscious mind, and archetypes. And this is where the psychological paradigm really starts to take form with this idea of archetypes, right? There are these, mystical archetypes. There are these sort of things that exist in our collective unconsciousness, right? And the collective unconscious is basically a psychological idea that there's something that sort of underlies us all, right? There's this linking of our kind of minds into this group unconscious thing, and they form in archetypes. And this is where the psychological paradigm starts to gain a bit of theology, right? These gods, these spirits, these demons, these angels, they're kind of archetypes that exist within our collective unconsciousness that we, can tap into. And by escaping, our conscious mind, our ego, right? Our day to day thinking, our day to day operating, we are able to sort of sync with these things and understand ourselves deeper, right? The big goal of Jungian psychology is to understand the unconscious, right? To understand there are multiple parts of the mind. And Jung himself was definitely a Gnostic, right? He had a lot of occultic beliefs, and he brought that into his psychology. And so his psychology, in a sort of, Ouroboros type way, got brought into occultic beliefs. To now, most occultists are Jungians to at least some extent. Varying degrees, but pretty much everyone is a little bit. And I know a lot of Jungian psychotherapists are kind of occultist in secret. There's some occult creators who are Jungian psychotherapists. So it kind of starts linking all together where it's like, okay, so there's this unconscious underneath us, and there are these archetypes, and it is more in our mind than external. And people, who were reviving, especially people reviving, paganism at the time, were very interested in archetypes, right? In the archetypes of these gods and the way they affect us on a collective unconscious type level, and the way we can sort of tap into these archetypes, even if they're not, necessarily full autonomous gods like people in the ancient world believed, right? That you can connect with them, and you can develop a connection in a way that perhaps, it's not as literal as some people think, but it's still beneficial because that archetype is still real and it still works in a psychological way. And there's kind of this underlying current that we can all tap into, and it is mental, but yes, at the same time, it still exists. And that was kind of the early psych paradigm belief, right? And then time moves forward and things get a little more fleshed out. There's a specific paradigm that I think really changed the game with all of this, and that is chaos magic. So chaos magic, it's a big system of occultism that's very popular now. It has its roots pretty early. There was this guy, Austin Osman Spare, who was a student of Thelema and of Crowley. And A.O. Spare was really interested in automatic drawing. So what he would do is he was an artist and he would basically allow the unconscious and the spiritual to guide his drawings, and he would interact with them. And he has a number of sort of metaphysical theories of his own. And, he wasn't a chaos magician in the modern sense. I mean, he wasn't like a true psychological paradigm, paradigm shifting type person, but he certainly was laying that groundwork, right? He did a number of writings that kind of laid this work now. And then, chaos magic kicks up. And chaos magic, we're talking the 1970s to the 1990s now. And it really wanted to take occultism in a new direction. These people were very psychologically oriented. And I would say most people now who would be psychological occultists are probably chaos magicians, or at least heavily influenced by it, even if they don't claim that name. And I want to discuss a certain misconception about chaos magic before I explore it, and that is that chaos magic is being chaotic. No, the word chaos does not mean literally like being chaotic and messy. And this is where people can get a little lazy. They're like, oh, well, I can do whatever I want. I'm a chaos magician. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, everything can be whatever. Nothing matters. Like, that's a very extreme position of chaos magic, and that's not really correct. And that's really used to spiritually bypass doing a lot of the harder work when people do that. But chaos magic itself is a paradigm that really does argue that this is all somewhat psychological, right? And that what you should do is you should kind of explore different paradigms and take what works for you and mix things, right? There's a high level of syncretism happening. And basically, you use these paradigms because you know that they work psychologically and upon you. And so they become real through working with your psychology, right? Like, all is kind of mental, all is mind. And all links to the mind, right? So when you do these mystical practices, you're linking to your mind, you're affecting your psychology. And the chaos magic approach, when done sort of well and correctly, is really about playing with the power of belief and the power we have to sort of shift our own minds, right? The ability that your mind itself is an incredible tool. You can make yourself believe something is real. And when you do this, it becomes real, right? It kind of manifests into the world, it manifests into the collective unconsciousness, and it forms a reality, right? And that reality becomes your reality that you can operate through. And so what a lot of chaos magicians would do is they would dive deep into specific paradigms, and they would shift them around, right? Like, they would spend a month doing, Vajrasattva Buddhism, right? And then a month doing Thelema, and then a month doing Nordic pagan rune work, right? And they would shift around with this. And what they would do is they would view them as technologies they are working with, right? They would see it as a tech, and they would, take what works and then bring it into their paradigm, and they would shift around to find what works and create a really radically syncretic practice using the techniques that work, right? Kind of seeing mystical practices as technologies that can be operated within, right? They're kind of things that you can use. And, as you shift through these paradigms, you're playing with your mind, you're playing with your reality, you're discovering, the benefits of this system. And then you create like a harmonious master system. It's kind of like, the final boss of eclecticism. And I really don't think, eclectic witchcraft, which came out of the 90s off of Wicca, really would exist without chaos magic, right? Because prior to this, people committed to one tradition. Like, this was not like this, like, belief shifting, high syncretism stuff where you like do Buddhism and then Nordic paganism, right? That's kind of a this time period thing. Like, people do that now, of course, but like, it really didn't exist prior to this. There were people, though, who were trying to create like master systems. Like, I think Theosophy is a good example of this, where Theosophy wanted to blend Eastern and Western mysticism together to create like one singular system, right? Trying to find basically with like Theosophy and also with Perennialism, right? Like, these are systems that are highly syncretic, but they had a very different mindset than chaos magic, because these highly syncretic systems like Perennialism, right, basically what they thought is that there was an inner truth underlying all these religions, and each religion is sort of a, you know, piece of the puzzle. And so you want to explore the whole puzzle to then find the true truth under it, right? Like the real inner truth that's perennially true. And that's a very external belief, right? Like there is some inner mystic tradition that all religions are gateways into, right? That's not actually like a you can just shift religions all that time. In fact, it's kind of like the dead opposite of that, right? Like it's like you have to find the true truth. And that's what those projects are trying to achieve. And chaos magic is not doing that. It's trying to literally, find what works and pull it together and sync around, because, chaos magicians, they're very psychological, right? They don't think there are ramifications from doing these paradigm shifts, right? They don't think that it really matters, because all of these things are kind of true because they're true in the collective unconsciousness, right? They work on that psychological level. So you can just do that. You can be Catholic for a month, then Buddhist for a month, and kind of like explore syncretism. Now, people who are in all of these religious traditions often have a problem with chaos magic because they think chaos magic is doing it wrong or watering it down. And those are, if you're from those traditions, very legitimate criticisms, honestly. But certainly that was the mindset. And chaos magic is, the predecessor to psychology, or psychological occultism, not the predecessor to all of psychology, obviously. But it really is the final boss of this. And basically, all these rituals, all these mantras, all these explorations are elaborate psychological exercises to work in the mind, right? Ritual. The reason why someone in the psychological paradigm would do ritual is because they understand the power ritual has on the psyche and the mind, right? They're doing it, not because they really think it's going to, connect to all these spirits, but that it's connecting to some sort of higher consciousness. And there's a specific, two specific ideas that kind of go alongside this, and that is egregore and zeitgeist. Zeitgeist is like spiritual quality of the time, right? Like there's certain zeitgeist or movements that have an energy to them, because there's all this emphasis put towards them. And then there's another one called egregore. And this is where, psychological paradigm stuff starts to get a theology of sorts, where basically like the thought is that all our thoughts have power, right? If we understand, the collective unconscious exists, these ritual texts can use our minds in really complicated ways and get us results, right? You understand that the mind is doing something. And so it's basically like the mind is creating divinity, right? And so there's this specific thing called an egregore. And an egregore is basically when a lot of people put their psychological energy towards something, it becomes real, right? Like an egregore could be a country, it could be a religious order, it could be, it could be anything. It could be a spirit of a place, right? So a zeitgeist is in an egregore kind of overlap. Zeitgeist is like spirit of the times, egregore can be spirit of the place. But you get what I'm saying. Like there are these sort of formed entities that essentially start to exist because of all our minds put towards them, right? Like the entities don't exist on their own, but they sort of feed off our mind and feed off our energy and our psychological output that we're all putting together, and it's forming these. And there's, specific, more complicated ones. Like there's, they're less intense, like in terms of their power level or whatever, but they're existing. Like chaos magicians are really into the idea of creating servitors or thought forms, which are basically like intentional. Like if all our minds create these egregores, and some people go so far as to say the gods are egregores, angels are egregores, the demons of the Goetia are egregores, right? Like if they can do that, then you can create your own and give them tasks, and that's really what a servitor is. It's like a specific mini egregore you create with your own mind in order to do some sort of mystical task for you. A thought form can be really anything. It's just, a bunch of thoughts creating a form. And yeah, so they really use these texts in order to, operate. And they say they get results. There's a number of projects that have come off of this. Like people have created the idea of the linking sigil. That's the LS or the Ellis sigil. It's this like E with a line through it. And this specific sigil was created, and then a bunch of people, started replicating it, and they used it to form this linking sort of power, right? The sigil had been used so many times, the consciousness had been put towards it enough that it sort of developed a form that people could connect to, and they could use it as like tapping energies. There's the idea of a macro sigil. So that's like creating a really big sigil over a place and then energetically charging the place through all that intended, focus and energy. And really, the mind creates everything. And this is, one that starts getting into like, yeah, like it's all psychological, but the psychological has created the external. I mean, that's, a more intense version of it, but that's certainly a perspective. And there is another way of viewing it, and I would call this, the atheo-pagan approach or atheist paganism. And this is people who, instead of doing all that chaos magic stuff like egregores, thought forms, sigils, all those things that kind of go with chaos magic. And these people, they aren't even really chaos magicians, right? Basically what they do is they pick one system, one theology, whether it's Hellenism, Ausatru, Wicca, right? And they, they don't believe in it literally. They don't believe the gods are literally real, but they believe, since so many people have worshipped them, they have a power to them, right? That archetype has some sort of weight to it. Or alternatively, they might not even believe in that. They might just think, it's a good, societal way of operating. It's a good thing to work towards. It's a thing to revive. And these people, they're pagans. They're often reconstructionist, honestly. They're trying to like reconstruct ancient paganism, but they're doing it from a quite secular perspective. They don't think it's literally real, but they think it's good. And that's its own can of worms, certainly. But that is, less occultic, a little more just on the religious side. They're just doing it for some other motivation. That kind of does fall under the psychological umbrella a little bit, even if other psychological practitioners might not like them. This is certainly probably the most criticized form of all of this because they're not really doing a lot of mysticism. They're just kind of saying like, I'm gonna worship X or Y God to what they represent, for the history they represent. And it's interesting the mix of people who do this because I find often they are quite political, right? But it's funny because you see people on the political left and the political right both doing this, often with the same spirits. That's always really entertaining because they take like very different interpretations of it, and they're like, well, I'm going to worship it for its societal reasons, for X or Y reason, right? And that certainly there are whole circles like that. There's whole organizations that basically work like this. Like they're not even really religious in any sense or spiritual in any sense. They just worship the gods for some sort of, other reason, right? And some of these people do get into archetypes and whatnot too, right? They're like, well, I'm worshiping X or Y god because I relate to their archetype. I'm worshiping Artemis because I want her archetype in the world, and I don't really believe in anything literal, but I still worship her and I still connect with the myths and all of this. Like that certainly does exist too. Now, I want to shift to the other direction, but I'm going to go through the middle position first. We're going to go on this like spectrum style. And this is people who kind of believe in both the psychological and the spiritual paradigm. And there's, gradations of this. I would say this is like a grading scale, where there's people who are mostly psychological, but they do believe there's a chance it's real. So there are people who are like chaos magicians, and they're very psychologically oriented, but they're also like, it might actually externally exist. And I find a lot of chaos magicians kind of come to this with time, where they're like, yeah, like it is all external, but anyways, I'm going to become a monk in Buddhism because that chaos magic system, worked the best for me. I really connected with Vajrasattva. And so yeah, I'm going to move to another country and become a monk forever because yeah, maybe I'm a little bit secular, but with time, I'm kind of starting to believe it's real. Like it's starting to work so much that I'm like, I'm questioning my position and my beliefs. So there's those people, there's people in the dead middle who think it's actually like about 50-50 external and psychological. So these people agree with all the points about the collective unconsciousness, about the power of the mind, about egregores, about God forms, but they also, do believe it is external. So these people, they often do a lot of manifestation work. So manifestation is the technique of putting a lot of energy towards something and then making it exist in reality. And if manifestation exists, kind of inherently you have to have a little bit of an external position because you are manifesting external change. Unless you're just manifesting change within yourself, like more self-love or more confidence, I mean, you kind of have to believe it's a little bit external. If you're saying like, I'm going to manifest a new job, I'm going to manifest money, I'm going to manifest a girlfriend, right? If you're doing that, but you're still thinking of manifestation as a little bit psychological. I mean, that's kind of a bridge position because you're saying, the power of my mind, the power of my focus, because it is connected with the collective unconsciousness and that affects the real world, it becomes real in the material, right? I'm using this to enact change. I'm using my will to enact change in reality that's making material change. So it is, the psychology then becomes external, right? The mind is then creating something outwards in the world and creating a ripple effect that it no longer is just psychological. Now, there are some people who do deity work that are also kind of in the middle, where basically, I mean, they're kind of agnostic in a sense. So they'll worship gods, they'll invoke gods, they'll do rituals, and they're just not sure whether the gods are psychological or external or kind of both. And these people, they do their rituals, they get effects, and they have kind of doubts and questions within them, but they keep doing it because it keeps working and they keep going with it. And then there's another position that's a little bit further over, which is people who believe it is both actively at the same time. So some people believe that that archetype thing is true, but also the gods are literally real. So that archetype, does connect to us psychologically. So it sort of begins with psychology and then it becomes real because that archetype, right? The archetype of Hecate, right? It begins with the archetype of Hecate within us, right? The idea of the crone, the idea of the witch, the idea of the outsider. And then by connecting that, by reaching into that archetype, you then reach out into the actual god and you connect with the goddess Hecate. And then you worship Hecate, you invoke Hecate, but you use that psychology as a bridge, right? You use your psychology as a way to connect to something higher. Like your mind is sort of the gateway upwards, right? It's that sort of step towards something higher. And this is kind of explored in certain metaphysical systems. Like if you're going from any sort of Kabbalistic, I mean any Kabbalah, you kind of believe that, that the first layer outside of the material world is Yesod, which is the sphere of the moon, which the moon relates to our feelings and our unconscious and our mind. And so Yesod is kind of that gateway sphere to then all the higher mysteries. So like you explore, your unconscious and your subconscious, and then you're thrust into the higher spheres. You're thrust into the external mysteries, right? Like you kind of have to start with psychology and then you push out towards the gods. And then it's entirely external after that point, right? That's certainly a perspective. And then there's another position. I don't see this argued as much, but some people believe that, the gods are real so long as people believe in them. So the gods are external beings with full autonomy. They operate as gods as long as there is energy being put towards them, right? Like the gods kind of feed off the energy of worshipers. And so this is kind of the idea that the gods have been reborn, right? Like the gods died when paganism fell out, and then they were reborn when people began worshiping them again. So this is you're leaning pretty hard towards theism at this point, but this is kind of a interestingly different theology that does deviate quite substantially from ancient pagan belief, right? Ancient pagans didn't hold this position that a god exists so long as there is energy tending to that flame. But of course, you want that energy tending that flame. But there are some people who really do believe that theologically. But other than that kind of belief, I mean, they operate as normal pagans and normal occultists and normal witches. They just kind of have a different theology that starts pushing them kind of towards the middle. And then there's that furthest over position before it's all external. And this is kind of where I fall, honestly. That is that, yes, it's all external, but our psychology has an incredible role to play in our experiences. So this is the last of the bridge positions, right? Like it's, the gods are real, the angels are real, the rituals actually do things. When you invoke the hexagrams, right, you're actually invoking the hexagrams, right? There's no, spicy psychology involved. But because we are human beings, we are below the gods in the divine hierarchy. So our experiences are filtered through our psychology, right? We can only comprehend as much as the human mind can comprehend, which is not everything, right? Our human minds are somewhat limited, right? We're not gods ourselves. And so, what we're thinking and dealing with affects our experiences, right? And so, it's like a filter position. And this is often a common argument for perennialist type beliefs. That the reason why, all these religions have these contradictory theologies, but at the same time have some unities, is that we are filtering external experiences through a limited human mind. So basically, you see some overlaps between Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, paganism, right? And those commonalities exist because there is something externally real, but because we're humans, we can't grasp it all. So our psychology is our filter to the higher mysteries. So once again, this is an external position. It is that perennialist theosophist type kind of argument, but it does pull some of that psychology, right? We are limited. That's the explanation as to why. And that's, a pretty solid point for a perennialist to be operating from. Because if a perennialist isn't operating from this position, there's a lot of questions that need to be asked about perennialism as to why has not one religion emerged like victorious? Like, why are there truths in multiple religions, right? Because that's, the big argument against perennialism. But if you have this position, perennialism is kind of like the logical conclusion, honestly. So yeah, now I want to move to the it is all external position. So, it is all external is the position that has existed in most religions throughout all of time. This is certainly the historic position, and it is that the gods are literally real. The rituals are literally real. You are literally working with external entities, and your psychology doesn't really play a role, right? In the pre modern world, we didn't have an understanding of psychology, that didn't really exist. So, it's all external. Like it's face value, right? There's no nuance there, right? Like it is there. It is external, it is real. And things like, you could even go really far with it. And I don't go yeah, I wouldn't go this far. I think it's kind of dual factor, but some people would even argue that things like psychology don't even exist because they're all spiritually caused. And I wouldn't go that far. I think there's a mix. I think most psychological things are both spiritual and psychological. I don't think they're wholly this way. But, you could argue that miasma explains it, temperaments like the choleric, sanguine, phlegmatic, these dispositions explain it. And, certain psychological conditions, just kind of are explained spiritually, right? This is, of course, a true historic stance. That it is all external. The gods are real. The rituals are real. And worshiping the gods is a must because they are real. They are our gods. Why would you not worship them? This position also, you can't really paradigm shift with it because, okay, if it's not, if it's all literally real, how would the chaos magic approach make any sense, right? Like if it's all literally real, it kind of it makes chaos magic kind of an unstable position to be in because you'd be mixing a bunch of different energies together that might not actually work well together. You might put yourself in a kind of dangerous position. You might, do things that don't work. You might put yourself in peril. Curses, hexes, manifestation, it's magic, it's all there, right? That is all real. It is all happening externally, right? It's all outside of us. The gods are beyond us, and we must reach out to them. They are unaffected by time. This is really the most static position, right? Like nothing has really changed. It's all literally real. Divination is all literally real, right? If you're reading tarot, the result is the result. There's no way of sort of changing it before it happens. If you're looking at astrology, that is your fate. I find full external positions can really get very fatalist. And I recommend listening to my Free Will podcast to explore that. And this is a mindset that a lot of people, I think, struggle to understand the full external mindset because, once again, we live in the product of our time, right? We're affected by these secularization windows like the Enlightenment, whether you like it or not. And so, this mindset, I think, when people approach paganism, can be the hardest to sort of move towards because it is so foreign to our way of thinking. I mean, even within Christianity, a lot of Christians are kind of actually middle seaters in this conversation. Like they believe Jesus and the mysteries and the sacraments are real, but they still think like it's also kind of our actions, right? Like a lot of religion in general has essentially been watered down to some extent because our modern minds are much more focused on rationality and logic, which were concepts that didn't really exist in the same way in the old world. And so adopting this type of mindset is challenging, but many people do it, right? It is a radical departure from the way people currently live, but it is a very rewarding way to operate. I mean, you're really honoring the gods in the strongest sense. You're taking it typically, to a very high degree of seriousness. I mean, you do your rituals, you don't want to mess them up, right? Right in this operating system. And you're probably a lot less syncretic. Most Reconstructionists, if they are not doing it for some other motive, if they are doing it out of genuine, serious devotion, tend to fall here. If you are a full Reconstructionist, I mean, this is kind of the logical position to land on, right? They're all external, the gods are real. They are not psychological, and our psychological experience doesn't filter it, right? Like our spiritual experiences we're having are literal. Because when we're talking about processing ritual experiences and processing mystic experience and having contemplation, the way people, experience these things, they're quite, liminal a lot of the time, right? They're often not like full on blatant hallucinations, right? Like most people who have, the gods come to them and they have a sort of visionary experience. It's something like a closed eyes hallucination. It's something like clairsentience. It's something like astral projection. It's dream work. It's like little voices you hear, right? It's often not like a really hard visual experience. So those do happen. And in those cases, you have to kind of interpret your more liminal experiences, think clairsentience, remote viewing, dreams, very directly. Whereas someone who has a psychological approach, even if they're bordering onto hard theism, would go, okay, well, how does my mind play into this, right? Like it's very direct, and it is, a very different way of operating than I think most people are used to. But I think that doesn't mean this should be an avoided position. I think it means that it's a challenge. And it's something that you can take on if you're willing to really explore an ancient mindset, explore ancient theology, philosophy, and really adopt a more holistic lifestyle. I would say that one of the best things this way of operating has is that it allows you to adopt a pagan lifestyle in a sense that other traditions struggle with. Because you really are connecting to how the ancients thought, connecting to how the ancestors thought. And so you're able to really build a lifestyle in a more strong way. And also, this position lacks a lot of doubts. And doubt, I mean, I'm of two minds about doubt. I doubt about doubt. I think doubt has a place. I think doubt and skepticism can keep us away from cults. But at the same time, doubt can be a hurdle. If someone has a high level of neuroticism and doubt about their spiritual experiences, it can really hold them back. And so having a little bit of doubt is good. But most people, I mean, that's not really the issue they have. Like most people's issue is not that they have zero doubt, it's that they have too much, right? They're too in their head that they can't fully experience things. And that's something you have to break beyond. Now, there are people on the other end of the spectrum where they have zero doubts about anything, and that creates problems of its own because you're more susceptible to things like cults and whatnot. And I mean lower C cult, the bad cult. But those doubts, I mean, doubts are tricky, right? And in this position, there's a lot clearer answers for things. Theology becomes a lot easier because a lot of these, theologies of paganism, say soft polytheism, hard polytheism, they kind of do lean in this direction, right? They're more external. And, if you're going to connect to some higher form of metaphysics, Kabbalah, Platonism, something like that, you kind of do need a baseline of belief and a baseline of understanding of it. And also, people interested in truth, this is very good because truth is obviously important. right? The biggest flaw of the psychological paradigm is that it lacks truth, and truth is really important in understanding the world, right? Truth is divine. Truth is our gateway into the mysteries, and it's much easier to get truth when you're going in the full version, right? You're going in that full external way of operating, right? It's much easier to understand truth. And from a mystic perspective, it is easier to have experiences from this. Now, I will say all of those perks kind of also exist if you have the position of, it's all external, but it's filtered through our minds. Like that does still, have those perks. But even then, there's some real benefit to viewing things wholly externally. And it really helps you develop devotion because I believe it was Frater Akkad or Frater Asher, one of the two of them said this. I'm sorry if I'm quoting it wrong. It was mysticism is the child of discipline and devotion. And discipline and devotion are the easiest to do from an external way of operating or a middle ground that leans more on the external side. When you're on, way on the chaos magic side, you're way on that side of the spectrum. Um, you know, it's kind of easier to slip up because you're less grounded in discipline. And when you're doing things like paradigm shifting between religions, right? You're less rooted essentially, right? And it's harder to form things that are really beneficial, like a daily ritual practice, right? Talk about a daily ritual practice a lot. And the reason why I do that is because a daily ritual practice is really a thing that grounds you in consistency and gets you the fastest result. And if you're moving around a lot, if you're thinking just psychologically, having those disciplines like developing a daily practice, developing, regular tarot reading, tracking the transits, it's kind of harder to do if you don't have a rooted sense, right? Like if you're not rooted anywhere, which of course the more external you believe, the more rooted you are. Like it's a sliding scale in that direction. Like the closer you are to an external position, the more rooted in theology and metaphysics you are, right? It's harder to be disciplined. It's harder to be devoted, right? It's kind of hard to be a really devout believer of an egregore, right? Like it's kind of hard to like worship from that position. And of course, not all occultists are interested in worship, but worship is really valuable. Theurgy, which is divine magic of the gods, is really, really valuable. And the more external you get, the easier those practices work and the more they make sense, right? That's really the problem with the psychological paradigm is that kind of, that Christians say it really well about certain Christians, right? They call it cafeteria spirituality or cafeteria Christianity, where you're kind of just like taking things, but you're not rooting it in any sort of truth. So you kind of lack a lot of meaning. I think the more external positions provide people with a lot more meaning, a lot more philosophy, and a lot more lifestyle stuff because, we want a holistic lifestyle. We want a life that all lines up and matches and works together. And these more religious positions, which the external positions are inherently more religious, right? There's more of a sense of religion the more external you get. It gives you a lot more purpose in the rest of your life. It helps you understand morality and virtue, which systems like chaos magic straight up don't really explore, honestly. Like virtue ethics is not really explored by chaos magic at all. But if you're a more external pagan, if you're more interested in, say, Platonic Hellenism, right? Like you're going to have a much bigger exploration of concepts like virtue. And so you can live a much more holistic lifestyle the more external you get. Now, at the end of the day, this is a internal question about your belief. And I want to just offer people all these options, help them understand each position and kind of the perks of each way of operating. I cannot answer this question for you. Now, I can say what I believe. I believe I'm like 99% in the external camp, but I do think there is a psychological factor. That's what I believe. And after my 8 years of experience, that's kind of what I think makes the most sense, honestly. But I don't want you to agree with me. Don't agree with me. Disagree with me. Actually, I challenge you to disagree with me sometimes. Like I don't want this podcast to be why you should agree with me. I'm not a proselytizer. I'm not interested in that. Because at the end of the day, your spiritual practice is between you and the divine. I'm just someone you can listen to. I don't want you to, it's not between me, you, and the divine, right? Like how you want to believe and how you want to work is your prerogative, right? Your practice is your prerogative. So I think what you should do with this episode is sit and ask yourself, okay, which position do I agree with? What am I operating from? Because I do think no matter where you fall, you should know where you fall, right? You should have a level of self-awareness. Because one of the keys of the mysteries is know thyself, which is basically, having knowledge of yourself and who you are and what you believe and what you stand for, right? If you don't know yourself, you can't know the external, you can't know the gods. So I think it's very important to know where you stand. And, if you don't know, if you're sitting and you're like, oh, I do rituals, but I'm not really sure, I'm kind of like a ritualist agnostic, really explore it. Think about your experiences, process your experiences through contemplation, and come to a conclusion. Go, you know what? That's how I feel. Or, you know what? Don't feel that way. No, 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 right? reach your conclusion, find your path, find your answer to these questions. Because I can't answer what you believe for you, right? I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I'm going to tell you, the options, and then you choose from there, because at the end of the day, it's your path, not my path. But I did want to share my bias and sort of give my position because, I think it's worth understanding what some practitioners believe. I've heard people, other practitioners I know I'm friends with, I've been in community with, say very different things, right? Say things that are all over the map, and different occult writers will have very different answers. So really explore the canon, explore other practitioners, have conversations, talk in the comments, and figure out where you stand. If you're reading this and listening to this, you're not reading this. How are you reading my voice? There's no transcripts for this show. I don't even do transcripts. So if you're listening to this, comment below your position and why. Speak to your experiences. What has made you believe what you believe? I think we can learn a lot from each other and foster community. So thank you for listening. This has been our show. If you want a reading from me, I'm a professional tarot reader and astrologer. That information will be in the show notes or the YouTube description. This show is brought to you by Patreon. If you join the Patreon, you get all the podcast episodes early. You get a bonus podcast episode 8 times a year. You get pre-shows, which are little mini podcasts before every show, like alongside every show. And you support the show and help it happen. So thank you for that. You can find me. I'm Georgina Rose. I go by Dot Darling on every platform under the sun. I'm mostly on YouTube. If you're listening to this podcast on YouTube, like many people do, just click on the face and you'll see my channel and you can see my other work. I'm on Twitter/X, whatever you want to call that. Twitter, formerly known as X. We can talk about it like that singer Prince, right? I'm also on Substack. I do 2 articles a month. I get into more niche and specific topics on that, quite a bit of history. I really enjoy the work I'm doing on Substack currently. I'm also on Instagram and Threads. I don't post a lot on Threads. If you're gonna check me out anywhere, I probably wouldn't choose Threads, but I am on Threads. And I think that's everywhere. I think that should be it. And if not, just look up Dot Darling. I come up all over the place. You can find me everywhere. Honestly, I'm all over the cyberspace. And if you're listening on YouTube, please like this video, ring the bell, and subscribe, and leave a comment. It really does help things get brought to the attention of more other people, and it helps me out. If you're on a podcasting platform, leave a review. That helps me on the podcasting platforms, and it gives me feedback. If it's a negative review, you know what? It's your choice. Leave a negative review if you want. And I mean, yeah, that's pretty much the show. Have an amazing day, afternoon, mid-morning, mid-evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are. Bye.